The Allied advance toward Germany is grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because of fuel. At the center of the storm stands General George S. Patton, the most aggressive commander in Europe, suddenly immobilized. And inside his own headquarters, a man wearing Allied insignia is quietly reporting Patton's weaknesses to another Allied general. Within days, Patton will pull a loaded pistol on a British officer and threaten to execute him. Not for treason against America, but for something far more dangerous: inter-Allied espionage. This is the real story behind why Patton threatened to shoot Eisenhower's British liaison officer, and how Allied unity nearly fractured at the edge of victory.
By early September 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared all but decided. After the breakout from Normandy in August, Allied armies surged eastward faster than even their planners had imagined. German formations were collapsing. Entire divisions surrendered. Paris was liberated. The road to the Rhine seemed open. But beneath the headlines, a crisis was forming. The Allied advance had outrun its supply lines. Fuel, especially gasoline, became the single most valuable commodity in Europe. The Red Ball Express worked day and night, but it could not meet the demands of multiple fast-moving armies. Every gallon sent north was a gallon denied elsewhere. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible decision: spread limited supplies across all fronts or concentrate them behind one decisive thrust. The British argued for the North. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery pushed for priority to launch a narrow thrust straight into Germany, what would soon become Operation Market Garden. Patton argued for the East. His Third Army, driving through Lorraine toward the Saar, was positioned to punch directly into Germany's industrial heartland. Both could not be fully supplied, and Patton was about to lose.
By mid-September, the consequences were undeniable. Patton's tanks began stopping, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. Armored spearheads that had raced across France now sat immobilized on open roads, engines silent, crews waiting. Patton was furious. His intelligence briefings showed German defenses thin, disorganized, and retreating. Prisoners confirmed it. Reconnaissance flights confirmed it. In Patton's view, the war could be ended quickly if only he was allowed to move. But gasoline shipments to Third Army were repeatedly delayed or reduced. Requests went unanswered. Priorities shifted north. Patton blamed Montgomery. Privately, he accused the British commander of manipulating Eisenhower, using inflated estimates, selective intelligence, and political pressure to starve American armies in favor of a British-led offensive. Patton's diary records his anger clearly. He wrote that his army was being deliberately stopped, not by the enemy, but by Allied decisions. What he did not yet realize was that information about his fuel situation was being reported directly to Montgomery from inside his own headquarters.
On September 17, 1944, the very day airborne troops jumped into Holland for Operation Market Garden, a British officer arrived at Third Army headquarters in Nancy. He was a liaison officer, polite, immaculate, clipboard in hand. British liaison officers were officially assigned to observe, coordinate, and facilitate cooperation between Allied commands. Their presence was routine and usually harmless. But Patton's counterintelligence staff had begun noticing something unusual. Radio intercepts, encrypted British transmissions originating near Third Army headquarters. Detailed reports on American fuel stocks, consumption rates, and reserve estimates. information that only a handful of officers should have known. The reports were being sent north to Montgomery's headquarters. To Patton, this crossed a line. Liaison was one thing. Intelligence collection, used to influence supply decisions, was another. And inside the map room, as Patton studied the evidence, his temper finally snapped. The confrontation that followed would become one of the most explosive moments between Allied commanders in the entire war.
The evidence did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to stay ignored. Third Army's G2 intelligence section had been monitoring radio traffic for weeks, filtering German signals from Allied communications. In mid-September, analysts noticed something odd. Short burst transmissions, British coded, originating repeatedly from the vicinity of Patton's headquarters. At first, this raised no alarms. British units operated nearby. Liaison officers used radios. But when analysts compared timestamps with Montgomery's briefings to Eisenhower, a pattern emerged. Montgomery's staff appeared to possess unusually precise knowledge of Third Army's internal fuel figures, down to daily burn rates, reserve levels, and projected exhaustion dates. These were not estimates. They were operational facts. Facts that only a handful of American officers had access to. Patton's intelligence chief ordered tighter monitoring. Logs were cross-checked. Transmission locations narrowed. Again and again, the signals pointed back to one place, Third Army headquarters. The realization was disturbing. Not betrayal, but competition. And in Patton's world, competition inside an Allied command was as dangerous as an enemy breakthrough.
British liaison officers were not spies, at least not officially. Their role was defined by Allied command agreements, observe operations, relay coordination issues, and ensure smooth cooperation between forces operating under Eisenhower's unified command. In theory, they reported upward only through Eisenhower's staff. In practice, the lines were blurred. British doctrine had long accepted intelligence gathering as a command responsibility, especially when national interests were at stake. Montgomery, fighting for supply priority, needed hard data to justify his case. To Patton, this logic was intolerable. He believed that American blood and American fuel were being leveraged to elevate a British-led offensive, one that Patton privately believed was strategically flawed and politically motivated. Worse, Patton believed this intelligence was being gathered without transparency, under the polite cover of liaison. To Patton, this was not cooperation, it was surveillance, and it was happening inside his headquarters, while his tanks sat idle and his soldiers waited for gasoline that never came. The officer with the clipboard was no longer invisible. He was a problem.
To understand what came next, one must understand how Patton viewed Bernard Montgomery. Patton respected bravery. He respected speed. He respected commanders who accepted risk. Montgomery, in Patton's eyes, embodied none of these qualities. Montgomery favored set-piece battles, overwhelming preparation, and centralized control. Patton saw this as caution bordering on paralysis. Their rivalry was not personal alone, it was philosophical. Patton believed war was won by momentum. Montgomery believed war was won by control. The supply crisis magnified this divide. Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17, received priority fuel, aircraft, and logistical focus. Patton's advance was slowed to support it.
When Market Gardens stalled, Patton fumed. He believed the opportunity for a rapid end to the war was slipping away, not because of German resistance, but because Allied commanders were competing instead of coordinating. And now, in Patton's headquarters, stood a British officer who seemed to symbolize everything Patton despised about that competition. The stage was set.
Patton did not act on rumors. Before confronting anyone, he demanded proof. His intelligence officers laid out the evidence inside the map room. Intercept summaries, signal timings, comparative briefings from Montgomery's staff, and internal fuel reports that had somehow traveled north faster than official channels allowed. Patton listened in silence. The room was tense. Officers later recalled that Patton's face did not redden, his voice did not rise. That, they knew, was the danger sign. Patton asked one question. Who has access to this information? The list was short. Very short. When the name of the British liaison officer was mentioned, Patton said nothing. He stared at the map, at stalled arrows and halted tank symbols, then slowly removed his gloves. What followed was not an impulsive outburst. It was a decision. And within hours, Patton would summon the liaison officer into the very room where those maps hung, unaware that his role, his safety, and Allied unity itself were about to be tested.
The summons was routine in wording and unmistakable in intent. The British liaison officer was informed that General Patton wished to see him in the map room. No explanation was given. No urgency was expressed. To those unfamiliar with Patton's habits, this appeared ordinary. Senior officers met constantly. Liaison officers were expected to attend briefings. But inside 3rd Army headquarters, the mood shifted. Patton rarely summoned liaison officers personally. When he did, it was usually to issue blunt warnings or force clarity on matters he considered obstructive. Staff officers exchanged glances. No one spoke openly, but many sensed the meeting would not be cordial. The liaison officer arrived precisely on time. His uniform was immaculate, his posture calm, clipboard under his arm. What he could not know was that every report he had transmitted, every figure he had shared, and every inference he had made had already been dissected and laid bare. The map room door closed behind him, and for the first time, he stood alone in front of George S. Patton.
Patton began calmly. He asked about the liaison officer's duties, about his reporting chain, about how information from 3rd Army was passed along to higher Allied commands. The questions were precise, professional, and delivered without hostility. The liaison officer answered confidently. He cited standard Allied procedures. He explained that liaison officers existed to prevent misunderstandings, not create them. Patton listened. Then he shifted the conversation. He asked how Montgomery's headquarters had obtained exact figures for 3rd Army's daily fuel consumption, how reserve levels were being cited almost verbatim in Northern planning documents, how assessments written in British briefings mirrored American internal memos. The liaison officer hesitated. He did not deny reporting observations. He insisted such reporting was routine, that Montgomery needed accurate data to coordinate Allied operations, that nothing he had done violated Allied agreements. To Patton, this was confirmation. In his view, the officer was not lying, he was justifying, and that distinction mattered very little.
What unfolded in that room reflected a deeper problem within the Allied command. Eisenhower's coalition depended on cooperation between nations with different priorities, doctrines, and political pressures. Britain sought a decisive blow that would secure its post-war influence. The United States sought rapid victory through overwhelming momentum. Liaison officers operated in this gray zone, neither spies nor mere observers. They were conduits of information, often walking a thin line between coordination and intelligence gathering. In September 1944, that line blurred completely. With fuel scarce, information became a weapon. Whoever controlled the narrative of supply sufficiency controlled Eisenhower's decisions. Patton believed Montgomery was using data, not battlefield results, to shape strategy, and Patton believed that data was being harvested from inside American headquarters. This was not a theoretical dispute. American divisions were halted. American soldiers were exposed, and Patton believed lives were being risked to protect egos. Inside the map room, the argument was no longer procedural. It was moral.
Patton stood up. Witnesses later recalled that his voice did not explode. It hardened. He spoke of stalled armor, of men waiting beside silent tanks, of opportunities lost while the enemy regrouped. He told the liaison officer that information, once removed from context, could kill as surely as artillery, that figures stripped of reality could justify decisions made far from the front. The liaison officer attempted to respond. He reiterated that Montgomery required accurate assessments, that Eisenhower made the final decisions, that no harm was intended. Patton stepped closer. At this moment, the room became dangerously quiet. Officers sensed the shift from inquiry to confrontation. No one intervened. Patton's anger was no longer abstract. It was focused. And for the first time, he questioned whether the man in front of him was an ally at all, or simply another obstacle standing between Third Army and the war's end. The meeting was no longer under control, and the line Patton was about to cross could not be uncrossed. For a moment, Patton turned away. He faced the wall map, not to disengage, but to regain control. Officers later recalled that this pause was critical. Patton understood the implications of what he was about to do. A public rupture with the British command could fracture Allied unity at the worst possible moment. Patton was not ignorant of politics. He simply despised them. He knew Eisenhower's command rested on balance, on managing egos as much as armies. He knew Churchill was sensitive to any slight against British authority, and he knew Montgomery's reputation in London shielded him from consequences. Yet Patton also believed that battlefield reality had been subordinated to diplomatic theater. As he studied the stalled arrows on the map, Patton weighed two unacceptable choices: remain silent and watch his army bleed slowly, or confront the source and risk an international incident. When he turned back toward the liaison officer, the decision was visible on his face.
Outside the map room, word spread quickly. Senior staff officers sensed that something serious was unfolding. Patton's chief of staff remained nearby, alert but uncertain whether to intervene. No formal protocol existed for such a situation. A British liaison officer was protected by Allied agreements, but Patton was protected by his battlefield results. Several officers later recalled that no one wanted to be the man who interrupted Patton in this moment. The issue was no longer whether the liaison officer had acted within technical authority. It was whether Patton believed the actions had cost American lives. In Patton's command culture, that question overrode all others. Staff officers quietly prepared contingency responses, calls to higher command, explanations that might need to be written, consequences that might need to be absorbed. What none of them could predict was how far Patton was willing to go to make his point unmistakably clear.
Inside the map room, the liaison officer made a critical error. Attempting to de-escalate, he appealed to authority. He reminded Patton that all liaison reporting ultimately served Eisenhower's headquarters, that decisions on supply allocation were not made in Nancy, but at Schaeff. To Patton, this sounded like deflection. Worse, it sounded like justification. Patton believed Eisenhower was being presented with selective truths, figures without context, reports stripped of urgency.
a picture painted to favor one army group over another. The liaison officer, by invoking higher authority rather than addressing the battlefield reality, confirmed Patton's worst suspicions. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was systemic, and Patton was done pretending otherwise.
Patton had spent his career mastering the use of controlled aggression. He believed fear, properly directed, could sharpen command and force clarity. Now, that control was slipping. His voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity. He spoke of deception masquerading as cooperation, of allies competing while soldiers died, of information being weaponized to stall an army in motion. The liaison officer attempted one final response. It never landed. Patton's rage was no longer aimed at a man. It was aimed at a system he believed had betrayed the principles of coalition warfare. Witnesses later described the moment as a transformation, from disciplined commander to something far more dangerous. And in that charged silence, Patton reached toward the symbol he had carried through North Africa, Sicily, and France, the ivory-handled Colt at his side. The room froze.
Patton drew the pistol. It was not theatrical. There was no flourish. The movement was fast, practiced, and unmistakable. The ivory-handled Colt 45 cleared its holster and came level, not waving, not shaking. Witnesses later struggled to describe the silence that followed. Patton stepped forward and pressed the barrel against the liaison officer's forehead. The distance between them disappeared. Maps, flags, and ranks ceased to matter. What remained was raw authority confronting perceived betrayal. Patton's words were clipped and furious. He accused the officer of spying under the cover of alliance, of feeding selective intelligence north while American soldiers waited for fuel, of manipulating figures to stall an army that could still move. The liaison officer did not argue. His hands trembled, his face drained of color. For roughly 45 seconds, seconds that felt far longer, no one moved. This was not rage unchecked. It was a warning delivered at point-blank range.
The standoff ended not with a gunshot, but with restraint. Patton's chief of staff stepped forward cautiously. Another officer spoke Patton's name, not loudly, not urgently, but firmly enough to break the moment. Patton lowered the weapon. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply issued an order. The liaison officer was to leave 3rd Army headquarters immediately and report back to his superiors. The officer did not wait to be escorted. He turned, exited the room, and was gone within minutes, his clipboard abandoned on a chair, its pages still filled with figures that had nearly cost him his life. Patton holstered the pistol and resumed his briefing as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everyone in that room understood the truth. An invisible boundary between allies had just been crossed.
The incident did not remain contained. The liaison officer reached Montgomery's headquarters within hours. His report traveled quickly to British command channels and soon after to London. Churchill was furious. To him, Patton's actions were reckless, undisciplined, and politically explosive. The idea that an American general had threatened a British officer with a firearm struck at the heart of Allied unity. Montgomery, however, reacted differently. He did not deny the intelligence gathering. He defended it. He argued that accurate information was essential to rational supply decisions, and that Patton's temperament proved why centralized control was necessary. Eisenhower now faced a nightmare scenario. 2 of his most effective commanders locked in a confrontation that risked unraveling the coalition. He could not afford to lose either. and he could not afford another incident like this.
Eisenhower chose containment. There would be no formal charges, no public reprimand, no court-martial. The incident would be buried quietly, handled through private warnings and tightened liaison protocols. Patton was cautioned, firmly. He was reminded that his brilliance did not exempt him from coalition discipline. But Eisenhower also adjusted supply allocations, subtly, quietly, acknowledging that Third Army's paralysis had gone too far. The war resumed its grim momentum. Market Garden failed. Patton advanced again, slowly. The supply crisis lingered. The rivalry endured. And the incident in Nancy faded into memoirs, whispers, and fragments. An uncomfortable truth about how close Allied unity came to fracturing when victory was within reach. The gun was never fired, but the damage and the warning was real.
To understand why this moment mattered, one must return to what September 1944 truly represented. Germany was wounded, but not defeated. Its armies were retreating, not collapsing. Every delay allowed defensive lines to reform along rivers, cities, and eventually the Siegfried Line. Fuel shortages slowed the Allied advance at a critical moment. Historians still debate whether a decisive breakthrough was missed or whether logistics made such hopes unrealistic. Patton believed momentum was everything. Montgomery believed concentration was everything. Eisenhower believed unity was everything. The confrontation in Nancy was not about one officer or one outburst. It was about whose philosophy would define the final phase of the war. And in that argument, no side held a monopoly on truth.
Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's gamble, failed to achieve its ultimate objective. Allied airborne forces fought bravely, but ground relief arrived too late. The bridge at Arnhem remained out of reach. To Patton's supporters, this outcome confirmed everything he had feared. Resources diverted, risks taken, and momentum squandered. To Montgomery's defenders, Market Garden had been a bold attempt to end the war early, one that came close and failed for reasons beyond supply allocation alone. What is undeniable is this: while Market Garden unfolded, Third Army remained constrained. Fuel trickled in. Opportunities narrowed. The war did not end in 1944. It dragged into winter.
The incident also exposed a deeper cultural divide. The American military emphasized speed, mass, and improvisation. The British emphasized caution, planning, and centralized control, lessons shaped by years of fighting alone. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but when fused under pressure, friction was inevitable. Liaison officers, meant to bridge gaps, sometimes widened them. Information flowed faster than trust. Numbers replaced nuance, and battlefield reality became subordinate to strategic narrative. Patton's reaction was extreme, but the frustration behind it was shared quietly by many American commanders who believed their armies were being restrained for reasons that had little to do with the front lines.
No official record of the confrontation appeared in wartime communiques. That silence was deliberate. Eisenhower understood that public discipline would only deepen divisions. Removing Patton was unthinkable. Alienating Montgomery was politically impossible. So the incident was absorbed, filed away as a regrettable but manageable breach. Liaison practices were tightened, communications were clarified, and all parties were reminded, privately, where the ultimate authority rested. Victory demanded compromise, even when compromise tasted like surrender.
Historians continue to debate the fuel crisis of 1944. Some argue Patton could have reached the Rhine before winter with proper support. Others insist logistics, not leadership, made such outcomes impossible. What is clear is this: Allied victory was not smooth, unified, or inevitable. It was contested at every level, by enemies and allies alike. The incident in Nancy reminds us that coalitions win wars not by harmony, but by managing friction without allowing it to fracture the cause. Patton's pistol never fired, but the warning it represented echoed far beyond that room.
In the end, Patton did not threaten to shoot a British officer because he hated Allies. He did it because he believed the war was being prolonged, not by German strength, but by Allied hesitation and rivalry. That belief may have been flawed, but it was sincere. World War II was won not by perfect men, but by difficult ones, commanders whose flaws were tolerated because their strengths were indispensable. The incident at Nancy was buried for decades because it challenged the myth of seamless Allied unity, and myths, like maps, often leave out the most dangerous terrain.
Stories like this survive only if people who care choose to support them. If this documentary added clarity, challenged assumptions, or made you think, consider subscribing. Not for us, but so these untold World War II stories continue to reach millions who never learned them in school. Your support matters more than you think.